Excellent. So the other thing is to cover that our work group here is covered by the Linux Foundation antitrust rules. You can find those on the website. We have a link in our meeting notes, which Ken has also shared in our chat. If you need that, just let us know and we can add it again. The other point is that we also follow the our code of conduct is available on our website. And in summary, it's be nice. Everybody is welcome to have a voice here. If anybody has any concerns, they can reach out to Ken or I and let us know. We're happy to handle that as needed, but hopefully we don't have to get to that. Today's discussion is going to be on schemas. And so one of the things that came out of the steering committee is that machine readable governance is very important for us to be able to move forward. And the prerequisite to that is for us to settle on some schemas. So that's where we are prioritizing our time, and we're very excited about elevating some discussion today on that point, and hopefully coming to a point where we can sort of vote on these attributes and settle in on a schema for us to move forward with. So I have Mike Ebert and I reviewed schemas in advance of today's meeting. And Mike, feel free to chime in, but I'm going to bring up the documents that we were reviewing and get in. Let's just jump in, if that's okay with everybody. So I'm going to share my screen, and just let me know if it's too small for you all to see.
You skipped introductions today, so
I did. Oh,
you need to allow at least a short pause for people who wish to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Ken. If there's anybody new or returning that would like to introduce themselves, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. So jumping into our schemas then, and if you want to introduce yourself later, you're always welcome as we get into our discussion for today. So hopefully you can all see this. If it's not big enough, let me know and I can zoom in a little further. But this is the draft schema that we have been working off of, and we did review this a couple of weeks ago as a preliminary review of schemas. But since then, the importance of nailing it down has really been elevated, and so we looked at it again, and there's a couple of things that we want to discuss with the group.
So let me interrupt briefly.
Absolutely.
This is one of three
Many.
schemas or four schemas that are being considered. So this is focused on the vaccination schema. Is that what we're looking at today?
That's correct. So we're going to start with the vaccination schema. The other schema I'm hoping we'll review today is the exemption status schema.
Cool.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of players involved in schemas. So if you were to go check out all the different schemas, and this is some of our discussion last time on schemas specifically, there's a lot of sample schemas out there that people are trying to use with varying amounts of data in them. So this is our first or second or third pass at trying to nail down what we think is important to a vaccination schema specifically. And thanks for interrupting. I appreciate it. Context is important. So, so to read this, we have the field name. We've put a category just for organization's sake. We also have the type of data that should go in that field, which I think is really important and has been missing from other schemas that we've reviewed previously. A brief description. I added, for historical purposes, we had prevalence of that data in US data, which is my frame of reference. And then I also have some comments for our discussion today. So I'm just going to navigate you through here and interrupt anybody if you have questions. The first two are identifiers for the, in this case, patient. So this is a sort of a master patient index or a high level identifier for that person. The next level of identifier would be more relative to their vaccination administration. If they have a unique, for example, medical record number from the facility where they were vaccinated. Speaking of the facility, there is sending facility, which is the organization that provided the data, that vaccination record. We have patient information, which includes the demographics. Now we've tried to standardize the language on these fields as well. So language matters. We want it to make sure that it's clear across the globe, and these terms are important. For example, gender legal is very explicitly which gender you're talking about, as well as state, province, region sort of neutralizes it to be a global term. So that's important for a couple of reasons. These demographic fields, primarily they need to be vetted to verify the patient on the matching of the request for the credential, but then also potentially back to the verifier to make sure that they are matching the person that's in front of them. This gives them some data points for comparison, which is potentially very important. Moving on, we have administration location information. So the facility, again, state, province, region, and the administration date. We have, and this is our sort of the first point to discuss, is dose number and series complete, which is usually like a yes/no status, and whether or not those should be included. We'll come back to that in a minute after we go through this. We have lot number, the vaccine code, qualifier, and name. And these three fields are really important to work in concert with each other, because if you put a code but you don't say what coding system that came from, then it's really hard for others to work with that code and understand what it's trying to communicate. So for example, there are CVX codes, which are tied to vaccine data. There's MVX codes and there's NDC codes. And so any one of those could be used to define which vaccine was administered. You just need to say which one you're using. That's the qualifier. Although we could change that language to system if that would be more understandable. And then the name of that, the human readable name of that vaccine. Similarly, manufacturer and the disease targeted by this vaccine. Again, code, qualifier, and human readable name. Right? So this could be an ICD-10 code, for example, or some other coding system like SNOMED. Vaccine education material, and then a couple of credential data points, including the whether or not, excuse me, the original issuer of this, if this is a sort of second party issuing this credential, and an identifier to link it back if it is in fact being sort of electronically issued on behalf of something else. So we went through here and I have a couple of questions. Let me pause and see if there are any comments to start with on this draft before I get into some specific questions.
I just have a small one. For the value type on a couple of these fields, we decided to suggest the ISO 3166 standard for coding locations, so that, you know, for example, a state may have an abbreviation and then a spelled out name, and then, you know, kind of a local name or colloquial name or something like that. You may have, you know, various names for a place. And so by using a standard that's already been provided by the ISO organization, you can code a place and have it be understood by everybody, and not, you know, eliminate confusion based on naming for at least places.
Oops, sorry.
So that's a small change that is probably good to bring up now.
Yep.
Keela, just a quick question. I'm not understanding exactly where this system allows for a different language, because it seems to me it's entirely English language centric and possibly even North American centric.
So I think when you say that it's English language centric, what stands out to you? Can you give me an example?
Well, if I'm using, for example, vaccination disease, I suppose if you use a code, it's one thing, but if you're using text, which is what's written there, wow, I've mentioned diseases that have vaccines here in Kazakhstan to people, and they had no idea what I was talking about, because it is a completely different word in Russian or in Kazakh, for example. That's why I'm asking, how do these get filled in if they're text values? Is it going to be, then we just assume it's entirely in another language and there's no real ability to connect the two of them? Or do we connect through it? For example, you have a vaccine disease target code, so maybe they'll all be the same according to the WHO, or how does that work actually?
Yeah, so in some cases, so first of all, the code and the code qualifier or code system are really important. In my experience and opinion, text is going to be really difficult for us to build into the governance rules for your reason as well as others, right? They may have spacing differences or naming convention differences, and that's going to be a really difficult machine readable governance rule to build. But if we have the codes and the qualifiers, then that should be able to be incorporated into the machine readable governance, so that you're not having to figure out, reading Russian if you don't speak Russian. It should be able to, in that machine readable governance, determine whether or not that is acceptable or not. And I don't know, Mike, if you have more you want to add to that in terms of the governance, but that's where those nuances would be addressed.
There's a couple of levels of fun here. One of them is, what is the attribute name? And that will be standardized in English and fixed as a kind of a rigid point of reference, so that the attribute name doesn't change. How the attribute name is displayed in your software is part of the internationalization and localization effort that Paul Knowles described in our last meeting. So although the schema attribute says vaccine code, your software would know to replace the vaccine code label on the field with whatever's appropriate in the localized language, so Russian, for instance. And that allows for interoperability, because the attribute in the software is actually vaccine code in English, but the display name can be labeled whatever it needs to be to facilitate ease of use for the various languages around the world. Then you look at the data that's inside of it, and Keela's described the codes to try to reduce ambiguity around that. Those codes are international standards for what the codes, and they're typically alphanumeric labels that say, Keela, what's a good example of a code for a vaccination?
Sure, 208 is I think Pfizer.
Yeah, so that translates pretty well between all of the different people who recognize the code sets that describe the particular vaccine. The text for fields such as patient surname or something like that, those can all be in the native language of whatever they originate in. Other text fields such as the vaccine code name can be done. Typically the medical community uses the same English descriptions pretty much around the world. There are some localizations of those descriptions, but those can be, again, with the overlays that Paul Knowles described, be adequately translated and have an overlay for an individual language that helps with understanding of locale to help translate those. Same thing with date formats, where a locale in the United States, it's typically month, day, comma, year. And in other places it's year, month, day, and in other places it's whatever they need to be. But the raw representation of the day inside of fixing it in the schema allows for the overlays to pick up and do the localization and correctly represent the date and time stamps and that sort of thing in a localized form. But the localization is a kind of the secondary topic. The primary one is to agree on what the data fields should be labeled and their attributes and what kind of values they should have in them. And then a secondary one is how do we internationalize to make it so it's actually usable by people around the world.
We did try to be careful about making this so that it would be adaptable to various locations and languages and things like that. And so we would definitely love specific feedback on any field that might be a problem, because we tried but we may have missed something.
Yeah, Mike is one of our 2 Russian speakers in DCO. So he has some sensitivity to making sure that things are displayable or manageable in Russian.
Jeff, does that address? Is there a follow-up?
Nope, that's good. Thank you. I just kind of wanted to understand how we're going, but Ken's statement that let's agree first on the content of the schema and then worry about it. That's a very important point. So yes.
Yes, I think really what we're trying to get to is column A and column C to say, like, can we use these things? And are they named correctly, right? Because if this was patient sex, that's kind of ambiguous these days, right? It could be their identity, or it could be their legal gender, or it could be their at birth. So which one? And labeling it explicitly so that there's not a lot of room for different interpretation, I think is really important for the success of a schema. Okay, so Mike called out that we have called out specifically ISO for location data, which is sprinkled throughout here. One of the things that I wanted to call out, and in our discussion offline, was the idea of vaccine dose number and series complete. So this is a little bit challenging data points for a few reasons, and I will list those, but then we can discuss as a community. Dose number and expects that the person who submitted this record knows whether it's the first or the second. They might not know that. And the same is true for series complete. So if they don't know if it's the first or second, then they can't also claim it as the series complete. And series complete gets more challenging because what if the definition of the series changes, especially with COVID, right, which is an evolving disease for us? We might add a 3rd shot, right, a booster, and that means that the series is complete. And so what was complete yesterday is now no longer a series complete. However, for those systems that may be wanting to issue one credential to say they're fully vaccinated and the series complete might then be an important data point. I think this schema was designed with the idea that it would be issued for each vaccine administered example. So in a 2-shot series, they would have 2 vaccine records, one for the first shot, one for the second shot, and then the governance and the request between the verifier and the holder would do the logic around, do you need to give me both to verify that you're fully vaccinated or not? Does anyone want to pipe in on the dose number and series complete challenge, maybe in your own experience with the data, or whether or not you think it's valuable to this schema?
Just to add a little color to the difficulty, when I was researching immunization series and completion and things like that, one thing we ran into We looked at, for example, California's laws on vaccination for doing things like attending school. And their recommendations on the number of vaccinations you need to receive vary by age. So when you're a newborn or going to daycare, the number of vaccinations you need may be smaller because you're not old enough to have received all of them yet than an older child. And by the time you get to high school, the danger of some of those diseases has mostly passed, and the amount of vaccine or booster that you need is also reduced. And so it's hard to say, even within just a single series of vaccines, what the proper number of doses is. And so that's another difficulty there. So making the dose number or the series completion rigid in one single credential seems like it's going to be quite problematic. Whereas if you have governance that's around each particular vaccine that you can update over time, then you can adjust for things like, based on the patient's age, you could say they need 1 or 2 or 5 credentials, or based on the date of verification, you could say as of July 8th, 2021, you need these many original doses and then a booster if it's been more than 6 months. So those are some of the other things that I encountered as I was trying to, work with Keela on, can we use these to, does it make sense to have in the schema?
So just from a travel perspective, I agree. I think we need both, even at a simplistic level. You've got nations at the moment talking about somebody needing to be double vaccinated, but then of course you've got the Johnson & Johnson variant that is a single dose COVID vaccination. And as already mentioned on the chat as well, there'll probably be the need for boosters. So I think you do need that. You need both elements.
Single
both
credentials. As single
well,
credentials.
I think you need both fields in order to be able to then make a decision. It's not just if somebody's had 1 dose, but it's the Johnson & Johnson variant, then that dose is complete. But you need 2 of the AstraZeneca or the Pfizer in order for the COVID. I mean, I'm just talking COVID specifically, of course, at the moment. But those requirements are part of what schemas need to provide for governments at the moment.
Bill, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think we're all thinking the same thing. It's extremely difficult to put a complete, not knowing what the drugs or the number of shots it would take to act as a complete. So you're using a single dose each kilo, like you're pointing towards, is complete once you've taken it, but it's added up. You may have 3 or 4 of those shots over the course of your records, with those individuals. But you're still complete, depending upon where you're at and which country you travel from. So,
Right.
I think you've got the schema set out, but it's going to be on a single per shot basis or per tablet or per whatever the next dosage will be in the future.
Okay, and I see Stephen, who you're welcome to pipe in, Stephen, but he put in the chat that the series complete may be a challenge because today it's 2 doses, but as we're all saying, we sort of anticipate that there may be a booster required in the future. So I think, to be clear, the question is, should we keep these 2 fields in the schema so that if organizations wanted to issue a schema with these, they're here? Or should we take them out of the schema, which sort of pushes the fact that it's 1 credential per shot, and the governance is where you're going to determine whether or not they're fully vaccinated based on whatever rules you put in place? As Mike pointed out, maybe you've had your 3rd, I think it's MMR, that's the one that you get 5 shots of through your childhood, but I'd have to double check. Right, you're on your 3rd shot, but it's age appropriate for you to be at shot number 3, and therefore you're good to go. That really can all live in governance, but this is sort of a fork in the path we need to consider. Is anyone opposed to taking these out of the schema? And Mike, you're in that, you obviously have an opinion on that too.
One thing that makes this a little trickier to remove is that these are fields that were in the Good Health Pass. And so if we're aiming for compatibility with other systems, such as the Good Health Pass, then
we would need to keep them.
We would probably need to keep them so that this schema translates into what they recommend, closely enough that they would accept it. And so it's the kind of thing where I think that if someone knows for certain which dose number this is, it doesn't hurt to include it. And if the understanding is the series is complete, but there's an issue date on this credential, then governance rules could say, the understanding was when this was issued, the series was complete, but our governance now says that it's not. Then that field after a certain date or a new governance rule could be safely ignored. So I don't think that it's harmful to put it in, as long as people understand that those fields may not be mandatory or would need some logic or governance around deciding whether they're valid or useful at a given date.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and I see some agreement happening in the chat as well. So we will leave them and we'll add some documentation about those nuances once this gets sort of fully fleshed out. Great. Okay, the next.
Are there objections to including them? Anyone object? Or, did we hear any opposing voices or allow for a voice? What I'm trying to make sure is that we listen to both sides of the story, and if there's somebody who strongly objects to keeping them in, then we can consider that as well before we move on.
I was one of the people who wanted to take them out, but as I've gone to look at things, I look at it and realize, in my opinion, it's pretty hard to remove them and maintain a schema that's compatible with everything, or that would make certain groups happy. So I kind of feel like we can leave it, but not, maybe
governance
for those
can
who don't,
decide.
Governance can help rule out whether they're useful or not. Decide. So.
Yeah, and I can. One of the things that I've been paying attention to is the fire standard, and so I sort of had this off on the side for us to delve into, but those fields do exist as data points that can be captured in the fire resource. And while they are not required, and I can tell you from my experience with the health data, are not necessarily always available, they do exist in the healthcare standard as something that can exist, that could and should be populated. So that's another reason for healthcare compatibility, that do you ignore the data point, or if it's there, do you allow it to be part of the record? I can, one other point that I would make is that one of the things that I'm aware of is also that sometimes a record gets lost in its electronic filing. And so the second vaccine is logged before the first vaccine got into the systems. Hopefully these are problems that are going to go away, but what was considered shot 1 series complete would be no, then gets updated because, oh, actually we found the electronic record for their first vaccine, and this was actually shot number 2 and does represent a complete series. So that's one other thing to think about, is that these might have to be updated if they were issued incorrectly originally based on a gap in the data. Hi, Paul. Do you want to chime in?
Hi, how are you? Sorry, I'm just getting to grips with the conversation, so I'll catch up in a bit.
Okay, excellent. Welcome. We're happy to have
Thanks.
you. Okay, so the next chunk that I think we should review is the addition of manufacturer data, and disease target. And these were added additionally for Good Health Pass compatibility, and because there are some differences between the vaccine code and potentially the manufacturer. I think that's in our current COVID example, that's not quite the case because, you know, it's sort of one of a few and that's all there is right now. But I think that this will become more important. And so these follow the similar structure of code, which would hopefully be slightly more universally compatible, as well as the qualifier and the name. And disease target is all same thing. So I don't know if there's any thoughts or comments that you want to add on that, but those have been added for compatibility to Good Health Pass.
Are there any WHO standards for those?
I know that I'm not sure about WHO, but I can tell you that there are ICD-10 standards. Their manufacturer is MVX, I believe, and that is there's a dictionary. So there are probably a couple of options that would go into the what kind of code systems people would be using and should be using for this. I'm sure that the WHO has some recommendations. It took actually at the beginning of COVID, there was no ICD-10 code. They had to add it to the dictionary specifically for COVID.
Okay. That's what I was thinking from a global rollout, you know, of having it capabilities there would be something that might, instead of just text.
Exactly. Text is, in my opinion, text is dangerous.
Yeah, that's what I've seen in development work.
It's very, very dangerous. And it's harder to write machine governance around. Now,
Correct.
one of the things that we don't have in here is which of these are required fields.
Right, I know.
Probably a whole nother conversation, and we have to have a very realistic chat about what's available and what's nice to have. Okay.
I have
the
a
other
question, Keela, about so we have this pattern where we have code like a code qualifier and a name.
Mm-hmm.
Is the intent that the code and code qualifier are the authoritative and that the name is there for convenience?
That would be my hope, but the reality is that that might not be the case. So this also, if I just jump over to, and I apologize, let me zoom in a little, sorry. So this is I've flattened the fire spec into Excel because that's how my brain works. And so this is the immunization resource. I want to make one really important point. The immunization resource is in trial use. It is not a normative standard. And I can tell you as I was reviewing this for the meeting, actually some of the fields have changed since the last time I had documented this. So it's important to keep that in mind that this isn't set in stone just yet. It's getting closer, but not there. And your question was on the code system, et cetera. So in, and let me just go to the field that matters here, which is, sorry, target disease. So in fire, it's target disease, and it's a code, what's called a codable concept. And so that makes it code system, and code name. And then there's another separate text field for it. So the hope is that we would be using the coding section before we used text.
It's the kind of thing where in the absence of a code system or an error with the code system, you may be able to recover by looking at the name. But I would prioritize the code and code system over a human readable name.
Yeah, and I can only speak with the data experience that I have, but in the data that I've seen for vaccines in the US, the code is there. There's some codes that are like a catch-all, like we know they got a COVID vaccine, but we're not sure which one, but it's still coded. I don't know if anybody else has a data experience around codes versus text in their.
I think so. I that makes sense. I was assuming that they could be both the code and the text present, and I'm hearing that in that case. And so my thought is that we could say that if both are present, that one is the authoritative, like the code is the authoritative. That way, should there be an error in the text, then there's a defined way to handle it because you default to what the code says regardless of what the text actually says.
Yes.
That's
And
kind of what I was going for. And if that's something we code into the operation of this schema, then that'll be
in the governance, yeah, it would be in the governance most likely.
Yeah, that lends itself to internationalization a lot better as well. So if
Yep.
you have a if you have a code there, then you can just use use overlays to change the languages, but the code remains the same.
We did invoke your name earlier, Paul, when we were talking about internationalization. So, but that was before you joined.
Yes, and in reality, again, in what's actually in the data, sometimes they only send the code in the code system. They don't bother with the text, and so then you can do a dictionary lookup to say, well, what's the human readable name? And that's where you could apply language things if you wanted to, so long as you also know the code system. They're a package deal. And let me go back to the schema, I apologize. The code is only as good as if you know what code system it comes from. So that is really important that these go together, especially as we start to think globally.
Hila, point of clarification. So the code qualifier is basically describing the code set that the code came from. Is that how that works?
Correct. We could change from a language, and language is very important here. This could be called code system if people would be more comfortable with that. But this is the code set or dictionary that this code comes from.
Yeah, so it's like SNOMED or something like that.
Exactly. SNOMED, in this case, CVX codes, MVX codes, and DC codes, which would be what's applicable for vaccines.
So
Okay.
quick question, Kila, what happens if could I just fill in the code? I'm just a busy nurse or doctor. I don't have time for all this. I just fill in the vaccine manufacturer code and go on.
I'm sorry, what do you mean?
Well, there's some of these, if I'm, let's say I just want to fill in the 208 for the Pfizer vaccine. I don't want to write in Pfizer. I don't want to write where it comes from. I just fill in, line 26 and I just move on. Can I do that?
My recommendation from a governance perspective is that 208 is fine so long as you know that it's a CVX code.
As long as you have to fill in 26 and 27. Otherwise, the codes can collide, or you have a meaningless entry in 26. The two are required. The third, so code and code qualifier are required. Target code name is not necessarily required. It's optional.
I think that most doctors are not going to be populating these fields directly, and you
Correct.
have some kind of interface that is going to translate what is entered by the doctor into the data that goes in the schema. And so for a US-based doctor, their systems are going to be using CVX codes to specify the vaccine. And so it would be more like the doctor selects the CVX code from a drop-down, and then the system populates that it is a CVX code, and there you go, you have both of the fields.
That's exactly right. So these things are generally coded into the electronic medical record where the data is being documented. There's some challenges with the global rollout of these vaccines because there were big distribution sites that didn't have great processes, but that effort is being cleaned up, at least again, with my reference of data and workflows.
Keela, are you adding predefined entries to some of these attributes? So I'm thinking like with CVX code for COVID, you could probably just do the predefined entries to make it easier for people so they don't enter the wrong codes.
Yeah, that would happen at the point of data capture though, right? Not necessarily on the creation of the credential. There might be translation that happens from the medical record component to when that gets translated into the credential. That's where you might say, okay, well, we used MVX codes and we think CVX is a little more standard, or we want to switch to NDC, or they only put the code And so we're going to put the name, populate the name just to be really thorough. That stuff I think all happens on the translation because it's not in this schema natively. It's in an EMR, electronic medical record. It's probably, maybe if we're lucky, in FHIR, but probably not yet. And then it has to be translated to this.
So Keela, Paul brought up an interesting point that I think we should discuss. And this schema is not a COVID credential schema. This is this a vaccinations or a COVID vaccination schema?
This is a vaccination schema, and I will be happy to change my little label here. Because the idea is that this is sustainable beyond COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just want to point out that one other thing on the qualifier, and this is very FHIR. For those of you who don't know the FHIR reference, FHIR, it's the Health Language 7 international standards. It's the newest of their standards for health data interoperability. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody who needs a primer on that. But FHIR is very, they use URLs for the code sets. And so it's possible that this text doesn't necessarily say CVX, but it's the URL for CVX. That's also potentially something that we could do here.
Yeah, the problem that you might have with URLs, Keela, is that for something that's verified, if there's a URL in the credential, what's behind the URL could change, which means that the verification might be, what's the word, not 100% secure. That's the only problem that you have when you have URLs in a verifiable
in a
credential.
schema. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not URL. Got it. Okay. Are there any other comments, or should we discuss, we should probably discuss this certificate and then we can go to our exemption schema if that's okay. So we've added 2 fields and maybe we need, sorry, go ahead.
This is Arj. I just have a quick question. So I know this might make it too complicated, but if we just take a step back and say, let's look at all vaccinations, not just for COVID, because I think there's going to be a need to be able to have credentials for all your vaccinations, especially for kids that are going to school. Is there a way to set this credential up so that it could be applied to multiple or, all the other standard vaccinations that are out there? Or does it just add too many layers of complication?
RJ, that was our intent here, and we did examine at least US-based laws around, in particular, at least a couple different states to see what they're doing for school standards for vaccines and so on. So we did take that into account, and hopefully there aren't any holes to allow this to work for any vaccine, not just COVID.
Correct. I don't believe there's anything in here that is COVID specific. In fact, the disease, you would populate something else if it were, smallpox, chickenpox kind of thing, polio, you could put that disease as the target for the specific vaccination. RJ, did you see something that you see as being COVID specific?
Yeah, you know what? Maybe that's just my frame of reference. My fault. Okay, that's great news. So that's good.
It's great to check, and good question, and I think we did account for it.
Yeah, excellent. If there is something, let us know. We certainly should discuss it. So the certificate is specifically in, right, we have this awkward period where we're going to have paper records and then we're in a certificate world. And we've talked a little bit about how do we manage that. One potential way to manage that is that there is a third party that verifies the paper records and issues the digital credential. And so these 2 data points, but maybe we need more, would account for that this was issued effectively by a third party and that this is the original issuing agency.
Yeah, I think with the issuer and identifier, also with the eHealth network, they've included that in their specifications, and they actually have some sort of proper syntax and stuff for all of the European countries. I don't know if that translates to the US and Canada, but that might be worth checking. I can have a look at that.
Excellent. Any other comments on the certificate issuer? Okay, so before we move on to exemption, are there other, sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead,
Keela,
Paul.
yeah, there was one other thing I wanted to check. So we're also looking at sort of a provenance chain between this certificate, credential, and the Good Health Pass over at Good Health Pass Collaborative. And there's actually an attribute, say in the Good Health Pass, there's an attribute that can link back to one or more credentials. So it could link back to the recovery and the test credential. And at the credential level, you can also link back to the test certificate, if you like. So there's a kind of a way of holding that provenance through the credentialing chain, if you like. I don't know. So we do it with just a single attribute. So that might be something you guys might want to think of as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to see that, Paul, because I don't remember seeing that for my scan of the Good Health Pass stuff, but you've done more thorough work there than I have. And so, yeah, if you could point us in the right direction for looking at that, that would be useful.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's not actually in the blueprint. It's in the specifications that we built kind of outside of that. So
okay,
yeah, I can send that over to you. No problem.
Excellent. Are there any other comments on fields that are missing or field names, naming conventions that we might want to adjust?
Yeah, I have one question. So is there a field that will speak to when this credential is actually issued to enable, for example, some kind of age of credential requirement?
So we have vaccine administration date, but we did not put a credential issuance date. And I'm not sure whether or not we should.
It's not typically in the style of Indy credentials that we're using. That's carried in the automatically. You're going to get a credential issued date, but you don't have to put it in the attributes of the schema itself. If we felt like that was a really important thing to put in the attributes of the schema, in addition to the one that's in the kind of the wrapping part of it, we can do that. But you get carried with it outside of this schema. Both the issuers did and the date of issuance.
So there's a way to build a proof request based on the age requirement.
Well, the age would also be the vaccine administration date versus the date of birth would also. You mean age of the credential?
Age of the credential, yes. For example, every year you're supposed to get this credential renewed, such as, vaccine series complete number can be updated to whatever the case may be. So again, we've looked at that, and actually we decided to include the date of issuance of credentials because we couldn't build the proof request based on age.
But if they're supposed to get a vaccine every year, then they should have a new vaccine administration date. Whether the credentials were issued or not doesn't matter.
Sure. But if some kind of requirement changes where, like we discussed, the series complete definition changes over time, then some kind of an institution may want to refresh all of these credentials and say, well, there's a version of a credential that we accept now where the series complete number has been updated.
So Vadim, what you're suggesting is that including the issuer in the schema as well as the issuance date would be helpful in some circumstances?
Yes. The global ID, we find that is useful. For example, when we run verifications of government IDs, certain partners would like that verification to be refreshed every so often. So a credential representing a digital passport needs to have a notion of age. And it's not tied to the government ID necessarily, such as expiration date information. But Ken, if you're saying that there's a way to build a proof request natively to include the age requirement of a credential, then we're covered.
Sam,
I don't think that's the case.
Sam, are you of the opinion that we should put the, what's your opinion on this?
Were you asking Sam Curran?
Sam Curran.
Sam Curran, can you come off mute? Okay, while we wait for.
Have you worked? You've worked with enough of the credentialing systems. Are you of the opinion that it should go in or out, or is there a mechanism that is satisfactory to your in your opinion?
Are you talking about the credential issuance date?
Yes.
That one? Yeah, we've left it in just because it's in the eHealth network specifications. But if there's something that is automatically pulled through in the metadata of the credential, then you might not need it. That's what you're asking, right, Ken?
Yeah, so I think everybody's in agreement that you need a credential issuer and a credential date. The question I think only that we want to debate, and you're in harmony with that as well, I think. Mm-hmm. But the mechanism for how to put it, whether it goes in the schema or whether it goes in the metadata of the credential, is up for debate. And Vadim is suggesting that it's awkward to do it if it's not in the schema. Did I characterize your opinion correctly?
So yes, exactly. So the only thing, Ken, to look out for is because the EU has quite a defined syntax for their certificate numbers. It might be worth keeping it in the certificate as well, in case that's a different some sort of a different identifier to the one that you're using in the metadata of the credential. That's the only thing I'm thinking. But if you can use the same one, then maybe you don't need it.
So I think the suggestion that I'm hearing is that we put in a credential issuer and credential issue date, even if they might be redundant with the metadata, and that might ease interoperability with some of the other ecosystems and make Vadim's life a little easier as well.
Yeah, that's what I heard as well. Do we have any opinions to not do that? Okay. So we have only 3 minutes left, and we didn't even get to exemption schema. So Ken, I don't know if do we have the bandwidth to let that go to another meeting?
Let's pick it up.
Go quickly.
Let's continue that discussion next week, and there's a little bit of research before we take a kind of a final vote. But I think we're going to start down the path. Is there anybody that objects to the what we've had covered today? Are we ready to say, hey, let's go with this one until we hear differently from implementers who are running into problems? I guess what I'd like to propose is that we take what we've got, including the credential issuer and credential issuer date and any of the other changes that we've discussed, and go forward with that credential schema until we hear otherwise, and we can start publicizing what we're doing. And if we get some feedback that says, hey, you really screwed up on and you missed out on a particular field, we can make an adjustment. But our emphasis is to do and make it work, and then adjust as we go. So we're going to be agile in the approach. Any objections to adopting the proposed vaccinations schema, with the caveat that we will review and consider any problems that are discovered as we start to publicize this more widely?
sounds like no objection. I actually have assignments to try and do something with this, so I'll be coding to this particular schema right away. And if there are changes, then I look at it and think, all right, I'll update which schema ID I'm using, and I'll have 95% of what I need already coded, and it should be pretty quick to update and be nimble once I've gotten that far. So I'll get going in my assignments, and other people can do so as well, using this, and we'll be nimble. Since nobody objected, it seems like a good idea to me.
Agreed. Okay, well, with that said, next week's agenda is to delve into the exemption schema and any other investigatory things that we get out of this schema review. So I hope that you'll participate again next week. And I appreciate all of the opinions that were voiced and feedback that we got today. It was very helpful, and hopefully we're getting there as a community. So I
That's
think
good,
we're
Keela.
good.
Ken, thanks. Paul, appreciate all the input.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
all next week.
Thank you for preparing this. It was great. Thank you.
No
Cheers,
problem.
bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.